The chains fell to the ground with a metallic whisper that changed everything. In the darkness of a South Carolina night, while thunder rolled across the rice fields, someone had done the impossible. 7 men stood in the quarters with severed shackles at their feet, and the overseer was about to discover that the weakest among them was actually the most dangerous. The quiet man with the limp had a secret, and when Caleb Foster finally understood what those scarred hands could do, he realized he had been mocking the wrong person all along. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun had not yet broken through the humid air when Caleb Foster stepped out onto the wide porch of the overseer's house, his boots heavy against the weathered wood. He was a man of 32 years, lean and cruel in the way that men become when given too much power over others. His face bore the permanent scowl of someone who found pleasure only in the suffering of those beneath him, and on the Riverside plantation in Charleston County, South Carolina, there were many beneath him. The year was 1857, and the rice fields stretched endlessly in every direction, their flooded paddies reflecting the pale sky like broken mirrors. Somewhere in those fields, 200 souls toiled under the weight of bondage, their lives measured only by their productivity and their ability to survive another day. Caleb's eyes scanned the quarters, the rows of cramped cabins where the enslaved population lived when they were not working. Smoke rose from a few chimneys where women prepared what meager breakfast they could manage before the day's labor began. He was looking for someone in particular this morning, and when he spotted the figure emerging from one of the furthest cabins, a smile of satisfaction crossed his face. Mason walked slowly toward the fields, his gait unmistakably uneven, his right leg dragging slightly with each step. The limp had been with him for 3 years now, ever since the accident with the wagon, and Caleb never tired of pointing it out. Mason was a man of perhaps 40 years, though his weathered face made it difficult to tell. He stood just under 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that suggested strength despite the obvious impediment in his walk. His hands were large and scarred, marked by old burns and cuts that spoke of some previous life, though no one on Riverside Plantation knew what that life had been. He kept to himself, spoke rarely, and never met anyone's eyes unless directly addressed. To most, he was simply another worker, perhaps slower than the rest, certainly more pitied than feared. To Caleb Foster, he was a source of endless amusement and a convenient target when the overseer needed to establish dominance. The morning roll call was a daily ritual that Caleb performed with theatrical precision. He stood at the center of the yard while the workers assembled in rough lines, their faces already showing the exhaustion that would only deepen as the day wore on. Caleb held a leather whip coiled in his right hand, not because he necessarily intended to use it, but because its presence served as a constant reminder of what could happen to those who displeased him. His voice carried across the yard as he called out names, marking each person present with a check in his ledger. When he reached Mason's name, he paused deliberately, letting the silence stretch out until every eye turned toward the man with the limp. "Mason," Caleb called out, drawing the name out slowly. "Step forward so I can see if you're still capable of walking or if we need to put you out to pasture like an old mule." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd, not because anyone found it funny, but because failing to acknowledge Caleb's jokes could be dangerous. Mason stepped forward, his face betraying nothing, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the overseer's shoulder. His limp seemed more pronounced as he crossed the open space, each uneven step amplified by the watching crowd. "Look at that," Caleb continued, circling Mason like a predator examining wounded prey. "Can barely walk, and yet the master expects me to get a full day's work out of him. Tell me, Mason, what exactly are you good for?" Mason's voice was low and steady when he spoke, barely above a whisper. "I do what's asked of me, sir." "What's asked?" Caleb repeated mockingly. What's asked is that you keep up with the others, but how can you do that when you drag yourself around like you're carrying an anchor? Maybe I should assign you to lighter duties. How about we put you with the women and children? Would that suit you better? Mason said nothing, which only seemed to fuel Caleb's irritation. The overseer wanted a reaction, wanted to see fear or anger or shame, but Mason gave him nothing but that same blank stare fixed on the distant horizon. After a long moment, Caleb waved him away dismissively and continued with the roll call. Mason returned to his place in line, his expression unchanged, though his hands hung at his sides with fingers slightly curled, as if ready to grip something that was not there. The workday began as it always did, with the workers dispersing to their assigned tasks across the vast plantation. Riverside was one of the largest rice producers in the region, its success built on the back-breaking labor of those who would never taste the profits. The fields required constant attention, from planting and flooding to harvesting and processing. It was wet, miserable work that took a toll on even the strongest bodies, and for someone with Mason's impediment, it was especially grueling. Yet he never complained, never asked for relief, and somehow managed to complete his tasks even if it took him longer than the others. Mason was assigned to the irrigation detail that day, responsible for maintaining the complex system of dikes and floodgates that controlled water flow through the rice paddies. It required walking long distances across muddy embankments, carrying tools and materials, all while navigating terrain that would have been challenging even for someone without a limp. He worked alongside two other men, younger and stronger, who treated him with a mixture of pity and quiet respect. They had seen him endure Caleb's mockery day after day without breaking, and there was something admirable in that kind of resilience, even if they did not fully understand it. "Don't let Foster get to you," one of them said during a brief rest, a man named Josiah who was barely 20 years old. "He's cruel to everyone, but he seems to have it out for you special." Mason nodded but said nothing, using a dirty rag to wipe sweat from his face. His eyes scanned the distant tree line where the plantation property ended and the wild country began. It was a habit he had developed over the years, always knowing where the boundaries were, always measuring distances and obstacles in his mind. "You ever think about running?" Josiah asked, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. It was a dangerous question, the kind that could get a man sold away or worse if overheard. Mason's response was careful and measured. "Running is for men with two good legs. I wouldn't make it a mile before the dogs caught me." Josiah seemed satisfied with this answer, perhaps even relieved that Mason was practical enough to know his limitations. They returned to work and the conversation was not mentioned again. But in the privacy of his own thoughts, Mason allowed himself a small, bitter smile. Let them all think him weak. Let them all believe the limp defined him. It made certain things easier, certain preparations simpler when no one suspected what those scarred hands were capable of doing. The day wore on under a merciless sun that turned the rice paddies into steam baths. Mason worked steadily despite the heat and the pain that radiated up from his bad leg with each step. The injury had been real enough when it happened. A wagon wheel rolling over his shin and shattering the bone in 3 places. But what no one knew, what no one had reason to suspect, was that the bone had healed badly on purpose. Mason had set it himself in the darkness of his cabin, positioning the fragments in a way that would leave him with a permanent limp, but would also hide the full extent of his recovery. A man who appeared disabled drew less scrutiny, attracted less attention, and was underestimated in ways that could be useful. Before coming to Riverside Plantation, Mason had lived a very different life. He had been born free in Virginia, the son of a blacksmith who had earned his freedom through skilled labor and careful savings. Mason had learned the trade from his father, working the forge from the time he was strong enough to hold a hammer. By his 20th year, he could craft anything from horseshoes to intricate ironwork, his hands developing the kind of strength and precision that only came from years at the anvil. He had married a woman named Clara, and they had begun to build a life together in a small town where free blacks were tolerated, if not exactly welcomed. But freedom in America in the 1830s was a fragile thing for anyone with dark skin, and it took only one dishonest merchant and a forged debt document to destroy everything Mason had built. He was seized one morning while working in his shop, his protests about being a free man ignored by men who cared only about the profit they would make selling him south. Clara had tried to fight for him, had brought papers proving his status, but in a system designed to favor certain outcomes, justice was an expensive luxury they could not afford. The last time Mason saw his wife, she was being held back by two men while he was chained in a wagon, her screams following him down the road until distance finally swallowed the sound. That had been 15 years ago. Mason had passed through 3 different owners since then, each one further south than the last, until he finally ended up at Riverside Plantation 5 years past. He had learned early on that fighting openly would only lead to death. But he had also learned that there were other ways to resist, quieter ways that required patience and planning. The blacksmith skills that had once been his livelihood became his secret weapon, the knowledge of how to work metal and understand its properties, a kind of hidden power that no one suspected existed. The evening bell rang across the plantation, signaling the end of the workday. Mason made his way back to the quarters along with the others, his limp, if anything, more pronounced now after hours of labor. The evening meal was a thin stew of rice and vegetables, occasionally supplemented with a small piece of salt pork, served from large pots outside the communal kitchen. Mason took his portion and retired to his cabin, a structure he shared with 2 other men who were already asleep on their pallets when he arrived. He sat on his own straw mattress and ate slowly, his mind already turning to the work he would do once darkness fell completely. His cabin was at the far end of the quarters, positioned such that its back wall faced the woods rather than the central yard. This had not been by accident. When Mason had first arrived at Riverside, he had quietly requested this particular cabin, citing his leg and his need for quiet. Caleb had agreed with a laugh, probably pleased to put the cripple as far from everyone else as possible. What Caleb did not know was that this cabin had a loose floorboard beneath Mason's sleeping pallet, and under that floorboard was a small collection of tools that Mason had been accumulating for 3 years. He waited until his cabin mates were snoring deeply, waited until the sounds of the quarters had settled into the quiet rhythms of exhausted sleep. Then Mason carefully lifted the floorboard and retrieved a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside were several pieces of metal he had salvaged over the years. A broken file stolen from the plantation workshop, several nails of various sizes, a piece of chain link he had found in the mud, and most importantly, 2 small iron tools he had fashioned himself during stolen moments when he should have been sleeping. One was a wedge, narrow and precise, designed to fit into the seam of a shackle. The other was a small hammer, crude but effective, with a head no bigger than his thumb. Tonight was not the first night Mason had worked on the shackles. For months he had been conducting careful experiments, testing the weakness of the iron used in the chains that bound his fellow workers. The shackles were mass-produced by northern foundries and sold south in bulk, their quality inconsistent, their weak points predictable to someone who understood the nature of worked metal. Mason had discovered that the rivets holding the cuffs together were particularly vulnerable, and with the right amount of force applied at precisely the right angle, they could be sheared away without making excessive noise. But it was not enough to simply know how to break the chains. Mason needed to choose the right time, the right men, and the right circumstances. He had been watching and waiting, building trust in small ways, identifying those who might be brave enough to run if given the chance. 7 men, he had decided. 7 who had families in the north or who had skills that might allow them to survive in the wilderness. 7 who had the will to risk everything for a chance at freedom. And tonight, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon promising rain and thunder to cover any sounds, Mason had decided the time had come. He left his cabin through the back wall where he had carefully loosened several boards that could be moved aside and then replaced. The woods were only 30 feet away, and Mason covered the distance quickly despite his limp, his movements practiced and sure. He had scouted this route 100 times, knew every root and stone that might trip him in the darkness. A quarter-mile into the trees, there was a small clearing where Mason had asked the 7 men to meet him. He had approached each one individually over the past weeks, speaking in careful whispers, testing their resolve, making sure they understood both the opportunity and the risk. They were all there when Mason arrived, 7 shadows among the trees, their faces barely visible in the dim light filtering through the canopy. They looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear, uncertain whether to trust this quiet man with the limp who claimed he could free them from their bonds. Mason wasted no time with speeches or explanations. He moved from man to man, examining their shackles by feel more than by sight, his fingers tracing the iron with the expertise of someone who knew metal. Like others, knew flesh. "Stay still," he whispered to the first man, a field hand named Cyrus who had a wife and 2 children waiting for him in Pennsylvania. "And stay quiet." Mason positioned his wedge against the rivet holding Cyrus's right cuff closed, then raised his small hammer. The first strike was soft, barely a tap, testing the resistance. The second was harder, and Mason felt the rivet begin to give. The third strike, timed perfectly with a distant rumble of thunder, sheared the rivet completely. The cuff fell open and Cyrus gasped, staring at his freed wrist as if it were a miracle. Mason moved to the second cuff, and within 2 minutes Cyrus stood completely unchained for the first time in 8 years. One by one, Mason worked his way through the group. Each man required the same careful attention, the same precise application of force, the same patience to wait for thunder or wind to mask the sound of metal striking metal. By the time he reached the 7th man, Mason's hands were cramping and his bad leg was throbbing from standing in one position for too long. But the work was done. 7 men stood before him with broken chains at their feet, and Mason allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before giving them their final instructions. "Follow the river north," he said, his voice still barely above a whisper. "Stay in the water when you can to throw off the dogs. There are safe houses along the way, people who will help if you show them this." He handed each man a small piece of cloth with a simple pattern stitched in white thread, a design that meant nothing to the casual observer but which would identify them to conductors on the Underground Railroad. "Go now, while the night is still dark, and may God go with you." The men dispersed into the woods, moving as quietly as their newfound freedom would allow. Mason watched them go, then gathered up the broken chains and shackles. He could not leave them in the clearing to be found. Instead, he carried them deeper into the woods to a place where he had dug a small pit months ago in preparation for this night. He buried the evidence, covered it with leaves and branches, and then made his way back toward the quarters. But as Mason emerged from the tree line, he realized something was wrong. There were lights in the yard, torches moving between the cabins, and he could hear Caleb Foster's voice raised in anger. Someone had noticed the freed men were missing, or perhaps one of them had been careless in returning to his cabin. Either way, the alarm had been raised far sooner than Mason had anticipated. He moved quickly to his own cabin, replaced the loose boards, and had just settled onto his pallet when his door crashed open and Caleb stormed in with 3 other white men behind him. "On your feet," Caleb snarled, his face twisted with fury. "All of you out in the yard now." Mason and his 2 cabin mates stumbled out into the chaos. The entire quarters had been roused, everyone standing in confused clusters while Caleb and his men moved among them with torches and whips. The overseer's face was red with rage, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the yard with the force of a physical blow. "Someone has freed 7 men from their chains," Caleb announced. 7 shackles cut clean through, and those men are now missing from their cabins. This is not something that happened by accident. Someone here has the tools and the skill to break iron, and I will find out who it is if I have to whip every last one of you until someone talks. A terrified silence fell over the crowd. Breaking chains was not just escape, it was rebellion, and rebellion brought consequences that extended far beyond the individuals involved. Caleb began moving through the groups, examining hands, looking for signs of recent work with metal, demanding to know if anyone had seen anything suspicious. Mason stood among the others, his face blank, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The small tools were hidden beneath his floorboard, and without them there was no evidence connecting him to what had happened. But then one of the freed men appeared at the edge of the crowd, and everything changed. It was Cyrus, the first man Mason had freed, and he was not alone. He had come back despite the danger, come back because he had realized something important. He pushed through the crowd until he stood in the open space where Caleb was conducting his interrogation, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "It was Mason," Cyrus said, and every eye turned toward the man with the limp. "He's the one who freed us. He's the one with the skill to break the chains." Caleb's head snapped around, his eyes fixing on Mason with an expression of utter disbelief. "Him?" the overseer said, his voice dripping with scorn. "The cripple? You expect me to believe that a man who can barely walk managed to free 7 of you from your chains?" Cyrus stepped forward, holding out his broken shackles. "Look at the cuts," he said. "Clean and precise, done by someone who knows metalwork. Mason was a blacksmith before he came here. Those hands," he pointed at Mason's scarred fingers, "those are the hands of a man who has worked a forge. I came back because he deserves to be known for what he did. He deserves to be seen." The crowd began to murmur, a low sound that grew steadily louder as people processed this revelation. They looked at Mason with new eyes, seeing him not as the quiet, limping man they had pitied, but as someone who had hidden depths none of them had suspected. Caleb's face went from red to pale as the implications sank in. If Mason had the skill to break chains, if he had been planning this for months or years without anyone noticing, then everything Caleb thought he knew about control and dominance on this plantation was wrong. "Show me your cabin," Caleb demanded, grabbing Mason by the arm. "Show me where you keep your tools." Mason allowed himself to be dragged across the yard to his cabin. Part of him wanted to resist, wanted to fight back now that his secret was revealed. But another part, the part that had survived 15 years of bondage through patience and planning, told him to wait just a little longer. Caleb tore through the cabin, overturning pallets and kicking at the floorboards. When he found the loose board and the bundle of tools beneath it, his hands shook as he unwrapped them. "How long?" Caleb asked, his voice barely controlled. "How long have you been planning this?" Mason met his eyes for the first time, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. 3 years, he said. "From the moment I realized my leg had healed enough to walk properly, but you all thought I was still crippled. 3 years of listening to you mock me, of letting you believe I was weak and broken. And in all that time, not once did you suspect what I was capable of." Caleb raised his hand as if to strike Mason, but something in the other man's expression made him hesitate. There was no fear there, no submission, just a calm certainty that was more unnerving than any defiance would have been. The overseer lowered his hand and took a step back, his mind racing through the implications. If word got out that an enslaved man had been secretly freeing others right under the overseer's nose, Caleb's reputation would be destroyed. Plantation owners throughout the region would hear about it, and his ability to find work would evaporate. "You've destroyed me," Caleb said quietly. "You know that, don't you? When the master hears about this, I'm finished." Mason's expression did not change. "You destroyed yourself," he replied. "Every time you chose cruelty over decency, every time you made someone suffer for your own amusement, I just gave you enough rope to hang yourself with." The crowd had followed them to the cabin, and they stood now in a wide circle watching this confrontation between the overseer and the man he had tormented. Cyrus stepped forward again, and this time 5 of the other freedmen were with him. They had all come back, drawn by some instinct that told them this moment was important, that bearing witness was as crucial as the escape itself. "We're leaving," Cyrus announced. "All of us. And Mason is coming with us." Caleb looked at the group, at their determined faces, and seemed to deflate. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, his authority exposed as the hollow thing it had always been. Without the weight of the system behind him, without the threat of violence to enforce his will, he was just one frightened man facing a crowd that had finally seen through his facade. "Go then," Caleb said bitterly. "But you won't make it. They'll hunt you down like animals, and when they catch you, the punishment will be worse than anything I could have done." Mason stepped forward, and for the first time since arriving at Riverside Plantation, he walked without a limp. His right leg moved smoothly and strongly, each step demonstrating the lie he had maintained for 3 years. The crowd gasped at this transformation, seeing the truth of what he had done and why. He had made himself appear weaker than he was, had endured mockery and humiliation, all so that when the moment came, no one would suspect what he was capable of achieving. "Maybe they will catch us," Mason said, "but at least we'll die on our feet instead of living on our knees." He turned to the assembled crowd, many of whom were people he had worked beside for years. "Anyone who wants to come is welcome," he announced. "I won't lie and say it will be easy or safe. Most of us probably won't make it to freedom. But staying here means living under men like Caleb Foster, means raising your children in chains, means dying without ever knowing what it feels like to own your own life. So choose. Choose right now what kind of person you want to be." For a long moment, no one moved. Then a woman named Ruth stepped forward, holding the hands of her 2 young daughters. "I'll go," she said firmly. "My girls deserve better than this." Others followed, a steady stream of people making the decision to risk everything for a chance at something more. Not everyone chose to go. Some were too old or too afraid, and Mason did not judge them for it. Freedom was not a gift he could give them. It was something each person had to claim for themselves, and the cost of that claiming was often more than people could bear. In the end, 32 people stood with Mason, ready to leave Riverside Plantation behind. Caleb Foster watched them go, his face a mask of impotent rage and growing fear. He knew what would happen when the master discovered this mass exodus. He knew that his failure to prevent it, his blindness to what Mason had been planning, would mark the end of his career as an overseer. But more than that, he knew he had been fundamentally wrong about the man he had spent years mocking. The quiet, limping slave had been the most dangerous person on the entire plantation, and Caleb had never even suspected it. As dawn began to break over the rice fields, Mason led his group into the woods, following paths he had scouted over years of careful preparation. They moved as quickly as they could, knowing that pursuit would come soon. Behind them, Riverside Plantation stirred to life, and someone would eventually sound the alarm. But for now, in this brief window of time, 32 people walked as free individuals, their chains broken by hands that had been underestimated and ignored. The journey north would take months and would cost many of them their lives. They would face dogs and slave catchers, hunger and exposure, the constant fear of recapture, and the terrible things that would happen if they were caught. But they would also experience moments of profound beauty and connection, would discover reserves of strength they did not know they possessed, would forge bonds that would last for whatever time they had left in this world. Mason walked at the front of the group, his stride strong and even, his limp abandoned like the chains that had once bound them. He thought of Clara, wondered if she was still alive somewhere, still hoping that he might find his way back to her. He thought of his father, teaching him to work the forge, showing him that metal could be shaped and transformed if you understood its nature and applied the right kind of pressure. And he thought of all the nights he had spent in that cabin carefully planning and preparing, enduring mockery and humiliation because he knew that patience was its own kind of strength. 3 days after the escape, word reached Riverside Plantation that Caleb Foster had fled in the night, taking what money he had saved and disappearing into the countryside. Some said he had gone west, trying to outrun his shame. Others whispered that he had been found dead in a ditch, killed by men to whom he owed gambling debts. The truth, like so many truths in those violent times, was lost to history. What mattered was that he was gone, and the people he had tormented were free of his cruelty. The plantation owner hired a new overseer, a man supposedly fairer and more reasonable, though the system remained fundamentally unchanged. The rice fields continued to flood and drain with the seasons, the harvest continued to enrich men who did none of the work, and the great machine of bondage ground on toward its eventual bloody conclusion. But in the quarters of Riverside Plantation, people remembered the night the chains were broken. They remembered Mason and his hidden strength, remembered that resistance could take many forms and that sometimes the quietest person in the room was the most dangerous. Of the 32 who left that night, 17 made it to freedom in the north. They arrived exhausted and traumatized, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memories of everything they had endured. But they were free, and that freedom transformed them in ways both beautiful and terrible. They built new lives, found work, raised children who would never know the weight of chains. And they carried with them the story of a man who turned his disability into disguise, who used his tormentors' contempt as a shield while he planned their liberation. Mason himself reached Canada in the autumn of 1857. He found work as a blacksmith in a small town near Toronto, and his reputation for skilled craftsmanship spread quickly through the community of formerly enslaved people who had made their way north. He never found Clara. Inquiries made through various channels turned up nothing, and eventually Mason had to accept that she was lost to him, claimed by the same system that had tried to claim him. The grief of that loss stayed with him for the rest of his life, a weight he carried alongside the physical scars of his years in bondage. But Mason also found new purpose in his freedom. He became involved in the Underground Railroad, using his knowledge of metalwork to help others break their chains, teaching them the techniques he had developed through years of secret practice. He never remarried, never built the kind of domestic life he had once dreamed of, but he touched the lives of hundreds of people who passed through that northern town on their way to safety. To them, he was proof that survival was possible, that intelligence and patience could overcome even the most oppressive systems, that the human spirit could endure and ultimately triumph over cruelty. In the decades after the war that finally ended slavery, Mason's story became part of the oral tradition passed down through families and communities. Details changed with each telling. Sometimes he freed 7 men, sometimes 70, sometimes he confronted the overseer with a hammer in his hand and fire in his eyes. But the core truth remained constant, a man who turned perceived weakness into hidden strength, who endured mockery and humiliation because he was playing a longer game than his tormentors could imagine. Mason died in 1891 at the age of 74. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Toronto, and his funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives he had touched over the years. Former slaves who remembered his help, children and grandchildren of those he had freed, members of the community who simply knew him as a skilled craftsman and a quiet, decent man. They stood around his grave and told stories about him, each person adding their own piece to the larger narrative of who he had been and what he had accomplished. The gravestone was simple, marked only with his name and years of birth and death. But someone, perhaps one of the people who had walked north with him that night from Riverside Plantation, added an epitaph that captured something essential about the man. It read, "He broke more than chains." Those 4 words summed up a life spent resisting oppression in all its forms. A life that demonstrated the power of patience and planning, the strength that could be found in apparent weakness, and the ultimate triumph of human dignity over those who would seek to crush it. Back at Riverside Plantation, life continued its grim rhythm for years after Mason's escape. The rice fields were eventually abandoned when the war came, their dikes and floodgates falling into disrepair as the economic system that sustained them collapsed. The quarters where Mason had lived and planned his liberation slowly rotted away, reclaimed by the forest that had always pressed at the edges of the cleared land. The cabin where he had hidden his tools disappeared entirely, its boards scattered and consumed by weather and time. But the memory of what happened there persisted in the stories passed down through generations. Local historians occasionally made note of the mass escape of 1857, though they usually got the details wrong, focusing on the drama of flight and pursuit rather than the patient, methodical preparation that made it possible. The role of the overseer who fled in disgrace was minimized or omitted entirely, as uncomfortable truths often are when they complicate preferred narratives. What the historians could not capture, what no written record could fully convey, was the transformation that occurred in Mason during those 3 years of seeming disability. Every day that he walked with that artificial limp, every moment that he endured Caleb Foster's mockery without response, he was engaged in an act of profound psychological resistance. He was refusing to be defined by his oppressor's perception of him, maintaining a secret self that existed beyond the reach of the system that claimed to own him. It was a kind of strength that required no physical demonstration, a power that grew precisely because it remained hidden until the moment when it could be most effectively deployed. This was the true genius of what Mason did, and it was the lesson that resonated through generations of people who heard his story. Resistance did not always look like violent rebellion or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it looked like patience, like careful planning, like the willingness to endure humiliation today in service of freedom tomorrow. It looked like a man with a limp who was not actually limping, whose body told a lie that his mind used as a weapon against those who thought they knew him. In the end, Caleb Foster's greatest mistake was not just in mocking Mason's disability, though that was certainly part of his failure. His fundamental error was in believing that he understood the people he claimed authority over, that their silence meant acceptance, that their apparent weakness was real rather than strategic. He confused compliance with agreement, submission with inability to resist. And when the truth was finally revealed, when Mason stood before him walking without a limp and explaining the years of planning that had just come to fruition, Caleb had no defense because his entire worldview had been proven hollow. The overseer had fled not just because he feared the consequences of his failure, Though that was certainly part of his motivation, he fled because he could no longer trust his own judgment about anything. If he had been so wrong about Mason, what else had he misunderstood? How many other people on the plantation had hidden depths he had never suspected? The ground beneath his feet had become unstable, and rather than face the vertigo of that realization, he had chosen to run. Mason never spoke much about Caleb Foster in the years after his escape. When people asked him about the overseer, he would simply say that cruelty was a kind of blindness, that men who took pleasure in others' suffering eventually lost the ability to see clearly. He felt no particular satisfaction in Caleb's downfall, no sense of personal revenge fulfilled. The overseer had been a symptom of a larger disease, and Mason's victory was not in destroying one man but in extracting himself and others from the system that had empowered that man in the first place. As the years passed and Mason aged, he sometimes reflected on the strange paradox of his time at Riverside Plantation. In some ways, those 3 years of pretending to be more disabled than he was had been the most difficult period of his life, requiring a constant vigilance and self-control that was exhausting in ways that pure physical labor never was. But they had also been transformative, teaching him things about patience and strategy that he might never have learned otherwise. He had discovered that there was power in being underestimated, freedom in being dismissed, opportunity in others' contempt. The limp had been gone for more than 30 years when Mason finally felt it return for real. Old age and hard labor had taken their toll on his body, and the leg that had once been genuinely injured began to ache and fail in earnest. He found himself actually limping as he moved around his workshop, the irony of this not lost on him. But this time the impediment came without shame or mockery. Was simply a fact of being 73 years old and having lived a life that included both terrible hardship and genuine triumph. On the day Mason died, he was at his forge working on a commission for a new church being built in the black section of Toronto. The piece was an ornamental gate, intricate and beautiful, showing off skills that had survived decades of bondage and found new expression in freedom. He had been hammering at a particularly difficult joint when his heart simply stopped, and he collapsed there among his tools, surrounded by the smell of hot metal and coal smoke. They found him hours later, still holding the hammer, his face peaceful in death. The gate was never finished, but the church preserved the incomplete piece and mounted it outside their doors, along with a plaque explaining who had made it and what he had lived through. It became a kind of pilgrimage site for people interested in the history of the Underground Railroad and the many forms that resistance had taken during the era of slavery. But perhaps the truest memorial to Mason existed not in metal or stone, but in the lives of all those people he had helped free. They and their descendants carried his story forward, adapting and embellishing it as all stories must be adapted, but keeping alive the essential truth at its core. A man had been enslaved and mocked and treated as less than human, and through patience and planning and an understanding of his own hidden strengths, he had broken free and helped others do the same. That was the story that mattered, the one that needed to be remembered and retold. Back in South Carolina, the Riverside Plantation was eventually sold and resold multiple times after the war. Its land divided and repurposed as the rice economy that had sustained it collapsed. In the 20th century, a historical society made efforts to preserve what little remained of the original structures, and the site became a small museum dedicated to telling the story of rice cultivation and the people who had labored in those fields. Mason's name appeared in their exhibits, though the full complexity of what he had done was difficult to capture in wall text and artifacts. Occasionally, descendants of the people who had escaped with Mason would visit the museum, standing in the reconstructed quarters and trying to imagine what it had been like to live there. to plan an escape in secret, to walk away from everything familiar in pursuit of freedom. Some of them had family stories that aligned with the historical record, while others had only vague memories of something their grandparents had once mentioned. But they all felt a connection to the place, a sense that something important had happened here that echoed through their own existence. The cabin where Mason had hidden his tools was long gone, but the museum had placed a marker roughly where it had stood. Visitors could stand there and look out at the woods that had offered both concealment and escape, could trace in their minds the path that 32 people had taken on that September night in 1857. Some visitors left flowers or small tokens, creating an impromptu memorial to a man who had turned his oppressor's contempt into his own liberation. In the final accounting, what Mason achieved was both singular and representative. His specific act of freeing 7 men and then leading 32 more to freedom was unique to him, the product of his particular skills and circumstances. But the larger pattern of which his actions were a part, the pattern of resistance and survival and the refusal to accept dehumanization, that was something shared by millions of people who lived through the horror of slavery. Each person found their own way to maintain their dignity and their humanity in a system designed to strip both away. Mason's method had been patience and planning, using his knowledge of metalwork to literally break the physical bonds that held people captive. Others used different methods, from open rebellion to subtle sabotage, from running away at the first opportunity to staying and maintaining family connections at great personal cost. None of these choices were better or worse than the others. They were simply different responses to an impossible situation, each person doing what they could with what they had. What set Mason apart, what made his story particularly powerful and enduring, was the way he transformed a perceived weakness into a strategic advantage. The limp that Caleb Foster mocked so relentlessly was actually a kind of armor, deflecting suspicion and allowing Mason to work in plain sight toward his ultimate goal. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, demonstrating that in systems of oppression, the oppressed often understood their oppressors better than the oppressors understood themselves. This reversal of the usual power dynamic was what truly terrified men like Caleb Foster. The realization that the person you have been mocking and controlling might actually be playing a deeper game, might be more intelligent and capable than you ever suspected, undermines the entire foundation of domination. It reveals that the emperor has no clothes, that power based on contempt and violence is ultimately hollow because it cannot see or account for the humanity and agency of those it seeks to control. The night the chains were broken at Riverside Plantation represented a moment when that truth became undeniable. 7 sets of shackles cut cleanly through. 7 men freed by someone no one had suspected was capable of such a thing. And when that someone was revealed to be the quiet, limping man who seemed to struggle with the simplest tasks, it shattered every assumption upon which the plantation's hierarchy was built. In that moment, everything had to be reevaluated. Everyone had to be looked at with new eyes. That was why Caleb fled. Not just because of the immediate consequences he would face, but because staying would mean living with the knowledge of how thoroughly he had been deceived, how completely his worldview had been revealed as false. Better to run and try to rebuild a sense of self somewhere new than to remain and face the daily reminder of his blindness and his failure. For Mason, walking north through the Carolina woods with 31 other people following him, the moment of revelation had been both triumphant and bittersweet. Triumphant because he had finally enacted the plan he had spent 3 years perfecting. Because he had freed not just himself but many others. Because he had proven that the system which claimed to be absolute and unbreakable could in fact be broken by one person with the right skills and sufficient determination. Bittersweet because freedom came at such a high cost, because so many had to be left behind, because the mere fact that such desperate measures were necessary spoke to a profound moral failure of the society that surrounded them. But he walked on, his real limp gone, his steps steady and strong, leading his people toward an uncertain future that was still better than the certain horror they were leaving behind. And in that walking, in that act of continuous movement toward something better, Mason embodied a hope that would outlast him by generations. The hope that human beings could not be permanently crushed, that dignity could survive even the worst attempts to destroy it, and that liberation, though difficult and costly, was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. The sun rose fully over the rice fields of South Carolina that morning, revealing the chaos Mason had left behind. Empty cabins, abandoned workstations, and somewhere out in the quarters, an overseer who would soon be gone, fleeing the consequences of his cruelty and his blindness. But that was all behind Mason now, part of a past he was actively leaving with every step. Ahead lay months of hard travel, years of building a new life, decades of helping others find their way to freedom. And all of it made possible by those scarred hands that could shape metal and break chains. Hands that had been dismissed and underestimated for so long that no one noticed when they quietly, patiently prepared the tools of liberation. This was Mason's legacy, the thing he would be remembered for long after the details of his life faded into history. Not just that he escaped, not just that he helped others escape, but that he did so by understanding something fundamental about power and weakness, about perception and reality, about the space that exists between what people see and what actually is. In that space he had built his freedom, and in building it, he had shown others that such building was possible. The chains lay buried in the Carolina woods, corroded and forgotten, while the man who broke them walked free under an open sky. The journey north tested every person in ways they could not have anticipated when they left Riverside Plantation that September night. Mason had planned as much as he could, had studied maps stolen from the plantation office during brief moments when Caleb was distracted or drunk, had memorized the locations of safe houses and the names of conductors who might help them. But no amount of planning could fully prepare them for the reality of being fugitives in a land where the law itself was their enemy, and where anyone they encountered might turn them in for the reward money that would surely be posted. They traveled mostly at night, using the North Star as their guide when the clouds permitted and relying on Mason's carefully memorized landmarks when they did not. During the day they hid in whatever shelter they could find, barns and caves and thick patches of forest where the undergrowth was dense enough to conceal their numbers. Food was scarce, and they survived on whatever they could forage or steal, berries and roots and occasionally a chicken taken from a farm in the dark hours before dawn. The children suffered most, their small bodies not built for the constant walking and the irregular meals, and more than once Mason wondered if he had led them all to their deaths, rather than to freedom. On the fourth night, they lost the first member of their group. An older man named Isaiah, who had been 63 years old and had worked in the rice fields since he was 7, simply could not go on. His body gave out as they were crossing a river, his legs cramping in the cold water. And despite the efforts of 3 men to hold him up and pull him to the far bank, he slipped beneath the surface and did not come up again. They searched for him as long as they dared, but the current was strong and the darkness was complete, and eventually Mason had to make the terrible decision to move on. They left Isaiah to the river, and Ruth led the group in a whispered prayer as they walked away from the place where he had disappeared. The loss hung over them like a shadow, making everyone acutely aware of their own mortality and the very real possibility that they might not survive this journey. Some began to question whether they had made the right choice in leaving, whether the known horrors of plantation life might have been preferable to this uncertain struggle through hostile territory. Mason heard these whispers and understood them, but he also knew that doubt could be as deadly as slave catchers or starvation. So he gathered everyone together during their rest the following day and spoke to them about what freedom meant. Isaiah died free, Mason said, his voice carrying to all 31 remaining members of their group. He died in that river as a man who had broken his chains, who had chosen to risk everything rather than accept the life that had been forced on him. That matters. That means something. And if we die out here, whether it's tomorrow or a month from now, we'll die the same way. As people who refuse to be owned. As human beings who claimed their right to determine their own fate. That's worth dying for, and it's damn sure worth living for. His words steadied them, gave them something to hold on to when the fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm their determination. They moved on, pushing north through the Carolinas and into Virginia, always staying off the main roads, always alert for the sound of dogs or horses that might signal pursuit. Twice they saw groups of armed white men in the distance, almost certainly slave catchers or patrols, and both times they managed to hide until the danger passed. Their luck, Mason knew, would not hold forever, but each day they survived was one day closer to the border and to relative safety. In Virginia, they received help for the first time from the network of people who made up the Underground Railroad. A Quaker farmer named Benjamin Whitfield found them sheltering in his tobacco barn and, instead of turning them in, brought them food and information about the route ahead. He was a small man with kind eyes who spoke in the plain language of his faith, and he told them that the bounty on their heads had reached $5,000, an enormous sum that would tempt even people who might otherwise have been sympathetic to their cause. "You're famous," Whitfield said with a slight smile as he handed out bread and cheese. "The plantation owner has been making noise all the way to Charleston about the mass exodus from Riverside. Says it's the worst case of organized escape in the state's history. The authorities are embarrassed, and they want to make an example of you." Mason absorbed this information without visible reaction, though inwardly he felt the weight of responsibility press harder on his shoulders. The decision to free those 7 men had set events in motion that now endangered everyone in this group, and if they were caught, the punishment would be swift and brutal. Public executions were not uncommon for escaped slaves who were recaptured, especially those who had helped others flee. Mason had no illusions about what awaited him if he was taken. But Whitfield also brought good news. The Quaker community had established a series of safe houses stretching from Virginia into Pennsylvania, and if Mason's group could reach them, they would have shelter and assistance for the remainder of their journey. Whitfield provided them with detailed directions to the first house, explained the signals they should use to identify themselves, and pressed into Mason's hand a letter of introduction written in a code that would mean nothing to anyone who intercepted it, but would tell conductors on the railroad that this group was legitimate and deserving of help. They stayed in Whitfield's barn for 2 days, resting and recovering some of their strength before pushing on. During that time, Mason had long conversations with the Quaker about the nature of slavery and resistance, about the moral imperatives that drove men like Whitfield to risk their own safety helping strangers escape bondage. The farmer spoke of his faith, of the belief that there was that of God in every person, and that any system which treated human beings as property was fundamentally opposed to divine will. Mason, who had a complicated relationship with religion after years of hearing it used to justify his enslavement, found himself moved by Whitfield's simple conviction. "How do you live with the fear?" Mason asked on the second night as they sat in the barn while the others slept. "You must know what would happen to you if you were caught helping us." Whitfield considered the question carefully before answering. "I do fear," he admitted. "I fear for my family, for my farm, for my place in the community, but I fear more what would become of my soul if I stood by and did nothing when I had the power to help." We are all accountable for our choices, Mason. And I choose to believe that doing what is right is more important than doing what is safe. These words stayed with Mason long after they left the Quaker's farm, becoming a kind of touchstone he returned to whenever doubt crept in. The journey grew harder as they moved north into the mountains of western Virginia, where the terrain was rough and the weather began to turn cold as autumn deepened toward winter. They were all wearing the same thin clothes they had left the plantation in, inadequate for the dropping temperatures, and several people developed coughs that worried Mason greatly. In a small settlement near the Virginia-West Virginia border, they encountered another kind of help, though it came from an unexpected source. A free black woman named Harriet, who ran a boarding house that catered to traveling merchants, took them in when she discovered them hiding in a storage shed behind her property. She was a formidable woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through any deception, and when Mason tried to explain that they were traveling to visit family, she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Don't insult my intelligence," she said flatly. "I know runaways when I see them, and I know that limp of yours is about as real as my white complexion. You're the blacksmith from South Carolina, aren't you? The one who freed all those people from Riverside Plantation." Mason tensed, ready to run if necessary, but Harriet laughed at his expression. "Relax," she said. "You think word doesn't travel along the network? We've been hearing about you for 2 weeks now. You're either a hero or a fool, depending on who's telling the story, but either way you need help. Come inside before someone sees you." She fed them a proper meal, the first hot food most of them had eaten since leaving the plantation, and she provided blankets and space in her cellar where they could rest safely for a few days. Harriet had been born into slavery herself, had purchased her freedom through years of careful saving and shrewd business dealings, and she used her position as a respectable free woman of color to assist the Underground Railroad whenever she could. Her boarding house was positioned along a common route, and she had developed a system for hiding fugitives that had so far avoided detection. During their stay, Harriet took a particular interest in Mason's story, asking him detailed questions about how he had planned the escape, what tools he had used, how he had managed to keep his intentions secret for so long. She was especially intrigued by the strategic use of his limp as a form of misdirection, seeing in it a sophisticated understanding of how power and perception operated in the world of slavery. "You're smarter than most," she told him on their third night there as they sat together in her kitchen after everyone else had gone to sleep. "Most people who run just react. They see an opportunity and they take it, which is brave but often foolish. You planned. You prepared. You understood that the most dangerous thing you could be was underestimated, so you made sure everyone underestimated you. That takes discipline and vision." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what I had to do to survive and to help others survive. There's no genius in that when just necessity." "Don't diminish what you accomplished," Harriet insisted. "Necessity doesn't automatically produce wisdom. Plenty of people face the same circumstances you did and never think beyond their own immediate situation. You thought bigger, planned longer, and when the moment came, you were ready. That matters." She gave them supplies when they left, real coats and better shoes, some dried meat and hardtack that would sustain them for the next leg of their journey. She also gave Mason something else, a small leather pouch containing tools, a file, a punch, and several small chisels. "In case you meet others who need your particular skills," she explained. "The railroad always needs people who can break chains." The gift moved Mason deeply, not just because of its practical value, but because of what it represented. Harriet was telling him that his role in the resistance did not end with his own escape, that the skills he possessed were needed and valued, that he had become part of something larger than himself. He carried that leather pouch with him for the rest of the journey and for many years after, using its contents to free dozens more people from their bonds. As they pushed deeper into what would eventually become West Virginia, the landscape became increasingly rugged and the population more sparse. This was both a blessing and a curse. Fewer people to report them, but also fewer resources and shelter options. They supplemented their supplies by hunting small game when they could, and Mason was surprised to discover that several members of their group had skills in this area that had been suppressed on the plantation but which now proved invaluable. A young man named Marcus, who was only 19, proved to be an exceptional tracker and hunter. He had learned from his grandfather, who had been born in Africa and brought over as a young man, and who had retained knowledge of hunting and wilderness survival that he passed down in secret despite the plantation's attempts to strip away all such cultural connections. Marcus could read signs in the forest that were invisible to Mason, could predict where game would be and how to approach it silently. He became their primary source of meat, and his contributions likely saved several lives as winter approached. They crossed into Maryland in late October, by which time they had been traveling for nearly 6 weeks. The weather had turned genuinely cold and several people were seriously ill with respiratory infections that Mason feared might become pneumonia. They needed to reach the border with Pennsylvania soon, needed to get to places where the law would offer at least nominal protection, or they would start losing more people to sickness and exposure. It was in Maryland that they had their closest call with capture. They were moving through a wooded area near a small town when they stumbled upon a group of slave catchers who were camping for the night. The encounter was entirely by chance, bad luck combined with exhaustion that had made the group less cautious than they should have been. The slave catchers, 5 rough men with dogs and guns, immediately recognized what Mason's group was and began shouting for them to stop. What followed was chaos. The group scattered in different directions, which was the protocol Mason had established for exactly this situation. Better to have some escape than to all be captured together. He found himself running through the forest with Ruth and her 2 daughters, the girls crying in terror as they fled the sound of barking dogs. Mason's leg, which he had not favored in weeks, now genuinely began to pain him as he pushed his body beyond its limits, the old injury reminding him that it still existed even if he had been ignoring it. They ran until they could run no more, until Ruth collapsed against a tree gasping for breath and the girls fell beside her in exhausted heaps. Mason listened for sounds of pursuit but heard only the wind in the trees and the pounding of his own heart. They had lost the dogs, at least for now, but they had also lost the rest of their group. Mason had no way of knowing if others had been caught or if they too had escaped into the surrounding forest. They spent that night huddled together for warmth in a small cave Mason found, the girls pressed between the adults, everyone too frightened and exhausted to speak. When dawn came, Mason made the difficult decision to stay hidden for the entire day, gambling that the slave catchers would move on if they did not find their quarry quickly. It was a long, terrible day of waiting and worrying, but when night fell again and they cautiously emerged from their hiding place, there was no sign of their pursuers. Over the next 3 days, Mason managed to reunite with most of the scattered members of their group. They had established a rendezvous point early in their journey, a specific type of oak tree that grew in a distinctive twisted shape, and Mason had been drilling everyone on the importance of reaching such a point if they were ever separated. The plan worked, and one by one or in small clusters people found their way to the designated meeting spot. But not everyone made it. 3 people were missing, 2 men and a woman, and after waiting as long as they dared, Mason had to accept that they had either been captured or had died in the flight. The group that pushed on toward Pennsylvania numbered 28 now. Diminished but not destroyed, still moving toward freedom despite everything that had tried to stop them. The border crossing into Pennsylvania was anticlimactic after all the drama that had preceded it. They simply walked across during the night following a stream that marked the boundary and suddenly found themselves in a state where slavery was illegal and where the law, however imperfectly, recognized their humanity. The relief was overwhelming and several people wept openly, the tension of weeks finally breaking now that they had reached something resembling safety. But Mason cautioned them against celebrating too early. The Fugitive Slave Act meant they could still be captured and returned south even in a free state, and there were plenty of people in Pennsylvania who would happily collect the reward money. True safety lay further north, in New York or even in Canada, and they still had significant distance to cover. Still, crossing the border marked a turning point, a shift from being hunted in enemy territory to being fugitives in a place where at least some people and institutions were on their side. In Pennsylvania, they received more consistent help from the Underground Railroad network. They moved from safe house to safe house, spending a night or two in each location, being fed and clothed and given information about the route ahead. Mason met dozens of people involved in the resistance, both black and white, free and formerly enslaved, all of them risking something to help strangers reach freedom. Their courage and commitment reinforced his belief that what he had done at Riverside Plantation was part of a larger struggle, that individual acts of resistance connected and amplified each other in ways that could eventually bring down even the most entrenched systems of oppression. In Philadelphia, they stayed for nearly a week with a prosperous black merchant named William Still, who was one of the most important organizers of the Underground Railroad in the region. Still kept detailed records of everyone who passed through his network, documenting their stories and their journeys, believing that someday this history would need to be told and preserved. He spent hours interviewing Mason, writing down every detail of the escape from Riverside Plantation, the planning that had gone into it, the confrontation with Caleb Foster, and the long journey north. "Your story needs to be remembered," Still told him, "not just because it's dramatic or inspiring, though it's certainly both those things. It needs to be remembered because it shows that enslaved people are not passive victims waiting for white saviors to rescue them. You planned your own liberation. You freed yourself and others through intelligence and skill. That's the story that needs to be told, because it counters the narrative that bondage is something that can only be ended by the benevolence of masters or the intervention of governments." Mason understood what Still was saying, though he felt uncomfortable with the idea of being held up as any kind of example or hero. He was simply a man who had done what needed to be done, who had used the skills he possessed and the opportunities that presented themselves. But he recognized that in the larger struggle against slavery, stories and symbols mattered, that they could inspire others and shape how people thought about what was possible. From Philadelphia, the group continued north through New York, their numbers dwindling slightly as some individuals chose to settle in communities along the way where they had family connections or employment opportunities. By the time they reached the Canadian border in early December, only 17 of the original 32 remained, including Mason, Ruth and her daughters, Marcus the Hunter, and Cyrus, who had come back to the plantation that night to identify Mason as the one who had freed him. Crossing into Canada felt different than crossing into Pennsylvania had. This was not just a shift in state law, but a complete exit from the United States, from the entire system that had held them in bondage. The British Empire had abolished slavery throughout its territories decades earlier, and while Canada certainly had its own forms of prejudice and injustice, the fundamental fact remained that no one here could legally claim ownership of another human being. They were, finally and completely free. The group settled initially in a small town called Chatham in Ontario, which had a significant population of formerly enslaved people who had made the same journey they had just completed. The community welcomed them, helped them find housing and employment, and shared knowledge about how to navigate life in this new place. It was strange at first, having to make decisions about where to live and what work to do, having to think about the future in terms of possibilities rather than just survival. But gradually, each person began to build a new life. Ruth found work as a seamstress and enrolled her daughters in school, crying the first day she watched them walk into a classroom where they would be taught to read and write. Marcus became a hunting guide, using his skills to help settlers track game in the Canadian wilderness. Cyrus found work as a laborer and began saving money to bring his wife and children north if he could locate them and arrange their escape. Each person's path was different, but they all shared the common experience of having walked those hundreds of miles together, of having trusted Mason to lead them to something better. Mason himself established a blacksmith shop in Chatham using money lent to him by community members who understood the value of having skilled craftspeople in their midst. His reputation spread quickly, both as a metalworker and as someone who had freed himself and many others from slavery. People began coming to him not just for horseshoes and tools, but for advice on how to help family members still trapped in the South, for assistance in planning escapes, for the specialized skill of breaking chains and shackles. He became deeply involved in the Underground Railroad's Canadian operations, using his shop as a safe house and way station for new arrivals. The leather pouch Harriet had given him saw constant use as Mason taught others his techniques for breaking bonds, spreading knowledge that could multiply the impact of his initial act of resistance. He estimated that over the years he personally freed or helped free more than 300 people from various forms of physical restraint. Though he kept no records and told few people the full extent of his activities. The work was dangerous even in Canada. There were kidnapping rings that operated across the border, attempting to seize free blacks and sell them back into slavery in the United States. Mason had several close calls with such groups, and he learned to be constantly vigilant, to trust his instincts about people and situations, to never assume that safety was guaranteed just because he was north of the border. But he never seriously considered stopping the work or moving further from the frontier. This was where he was needed, where his skills could make the greatest difference. And so this was where he would stay. The chains lay buried in the Carolina woods, corroded and forgotten, while the man who broke them walked free under an open sky.